Good. We got a PowerPoint then. We're into our Isaiah series. Last week Steve preached on Isaiah 40, and I think captured the sort of heart and spirit of that really, really well. And you may remember the summary of chapter 40 was comfort, hope and strength to God's people. And it culminated in those, there's so many of these sort of like classic verses in this bit of Isaiah, aren't there? It culminated in, even youths shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. That's one of those scriptures that you just sort of take in any context almost, don't you, and receive encouragement from. And we're moving straight on from that, and we're going to do today very much as a sort of Bible passage commentary. We're going to read nearly all the chapter. I've edited out a couple of verses just for time, and I'm going to comment on them as we go through. So it's going to be very much based on reading the scripture and seeing what God's saying to us. But one thing that I think it is important for us to remember is that all of these words are spoken into very difficult times. And what Tom shared and highlighted from Isaiah 40 is pretty much exactly what I want to sort of speak on today. These words are spoken into a situation where Israel has been conquered. Israel and Judah, both the kingdoms have been conquered. Foreign empires have overrun them. Jerusalem is in ruins and deserted and partially under foreign occupation, and the people of Israel and Judah are in exile. They've been scattered. God appears to be silent. And it's into that situation, so you've got these amazingly encouraging verses, but they're not sort of like happy clappy verses in easy peasy situations. They're strong verses of hope and encouragement spoken into really difficult situations. This is hardcore spiritual strengthening that is going on in Isaiah. It's not superficial, and it's perhaps easy for us, if we're in easy circumstances, to just pick out the happy verses. But actually, this is God saying, this is true even in difficult times. So, what we're looking at today really is living protected in dangerous times. And seeing God's help and God's protection even in circumstances that are difficult and challenging. Maybe in our personal lives, but also maybe on a sort of more of a global world level. Because God is dealing here with global imperial forces as well as the sort of, if you like, the mentality of the people of Israel themselves. And actually, as I was reading Isaiah 41 and preparing this, I thought, what we're going to see in Isaiah 41 is pretty much exactly what Jesus said in John 16:33, where he says, I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And the Christian message is not, hey, there's not going to be trouble. It's not, hey, God will rescue you from every difficult situation. But it is you in the midst of that can have peace because I, Jesus, have overcome the world. And it's that's, if you like, as we read through Isaiah 41, which we're going to do now, that's really the message. Okay, now, Isaiah 41 is something of a sandwich. Verses 1 to 7 and 21 to 29 are primarily addressed to the nations. And the bit in the middle is addressed to God's people Israel. So I'm doing this slightly sort of out of verse chronology or whatever. And we're going to read a bit at the beginning, a bit at the end, and then we're going to come back and read a bit in the middle. Okay, but let's just have a look at what's actually in the passage. It starts with a sort of a courtroom scene. God says, "Listen to me in silence, O coastlands. Let the peoples renew their strength. Let them approach, then let them speak. Let us together draw near for judgment." God is saying to the nations and the powers of the world, listen to me. We are going to meet up. And you are going to recognise what's going on. And he says to them this: "Who stirred up one from the east, whom victory meets at every step? He gives up nations before him, so that he tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword, like driven stubble with his bow. He pursues them and passes on safely by paths his feet have not trod." Now, this is a reference to Cyrus the Great of Persia, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but the one who is coming from the east and is trampling everything before him is the one from the east. And the nations are petrified of what is going on. Who has performed and done this? Calling the generations from the beginning. I, the Lord, the first, and with the last. I am he. The coastlands have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. They have drawn near and come. So, what God is addressing here is a situation where there is a big change in world power politics. And Cyrus the Great is a great Persian ruler who has risen up, and at this time, under his rule, the Persian Empire is sweeping all before it. And all the empires of that region are crumbling in the face of this great imperial force. And he conquers the Median Empire, and then he conquers the Lydian Empire, and he conquers the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire that was the one that took Israel into exile to Babylon. And in fact, Cyrus sweeps all before him, establishing the largest empire the world had yet seen. Cyrus conquered an empire stretching from the Balkans in the west to the River Indus, northern India in the east. And the entire region had fallen to this military superpower, basically. And the nations are panicking. They have seen and are afraid. The ends of the earth tremble. And they are sort of victims of political and military forces that are too great for them. And they are running around trying to find hopeless solutions. And I was just sort of made me think, how does that apply to us today? And there are all sorts of things that we may look at in the world, or the nations, as it were, may look at in the world and be fearful of. There are forces that are going on that seem out of control, that seem threatening, and that cause fear. This was off the top of my head, I came up with a number of ideas. What might be causing fear in the world today? Rise of the Taliban again in Afghanistan. That took everybody by surprise. Nobody seemed to realise that within days of America leaving Afghanistan, the Taliban would be back in power. And that creates fear, terrible fear in that part of the world, and maybe fear more widely. All around the world, suppression of human rights, collapse of democracy, opposition leaders being imprisoned, flights being intercepted so that the Belarusian ruler can arrest an opposition leader. Maybe your fear is the rise of populism and right-wing extremism and conspiracy theories. that get a hold over people. Maybe in the West we're worried about rampant liberalism and the silencing of the Christian voice in the progressive West. Maybe we're worried about the tyranny of the media and the power of social media and the control it has over people's minds and spirits. Maybe we're worried about climate change and the future of planet Earth. Oh no, I nearly forgot that one. Pandemics. There are so many things. In the day of Isaiah 41, it was the rise of Cyrus the Great, an imperial expansion and conquest. But we can look around us today, and there's any number of big political, military, social, whatever, cultural forces or natural forces in case of climate change and pandemics that may cause the nations, may cause fear for people. And if we're not careful, we get caught up in that climate of fear and anxiety and hopelessness in the face of big things going on. See, God isn't just a little God who does nice things in church on a Sunday. If our faith is worth anything, it's got to be worth something in the face of global situations like this. And you see, the world doesn't really know what to do about it. Everyone helps his neighbour and says to his brother, "Take courage." That's very nice. A lot of comments during COVID about how it brought out neighbourliness. Everybody realises they need one another. But they've got no solution. You see, the craftsman encourages the goldsmith, and he who smooths with the hammer, him who strikes the anvil, saying of the soldering, "It is good," and they fasten it with nails so it can't be moved. What are they doing? They're building an idol. They're floundering around, trying to support one another, encouraging one another, but the best they can do is knock together a new idol. And if our hope is in the ways of the world and the solution of the world, we're not going to find answers, and we're not going to be safe in a troubled and dangerous world. The world seeks answers. Again, I've just taken some ideas to give you a flavour. Maybe it's a political movement. For how many people in the early 20th century was communism, the political movement that would bring righteousness and justice to the world? For how many people in the late 20th century, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, proclaimed the end of history? Liberal democracy had triumphed. That was going to be the answer to mankind's problems. It wasn't. What about an individual leader? How often have nations looked and people looked to a charismatic leader to save them? And how often has that gone very badly wrong? An idea or a cause, a technological breakthrough, a vaccine. Vaccines are great, but they're not our salvation, ultimately. Maybe technology is going to save us. And in our world of mass media, there are so many opinions, so many answers. People are floundering around, trying to encourage one another. Take courage. Here's an answer. There's an answer. They are... Okay, I'm not saying it's all rubbish. Wisdom shouts aloud at every corner. Godly wisdom is available to mankind, and there are better and worse movements, causes, leaders, technology. But it's on its own, it's not the answer. You see, and there are idols. So much futility, so much folly, so much fear. And we come back to it in verses 21 to 29. So I'm going to jump the bit where God speaks to his people. God sort of issues a challenge. Set forth your case. Remember the courtroom at the start of the chapter. Set forth your case, says the Lord. Bring your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring them, and tell us what is to happen. Tell us the former things, what they are, that we may consider them, that we may know their outcome, or declare to us the things to come. Tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know you are gods. Do good or do harm, that we may be dismayed and terrified. Behold, you are nothing, and your work is naught. An abomination is he who chooses you. This is God striking at the idols of the nations, the false demonic hopes that are put out to the nations. There's a bit of a sort of, Steve talked about rhetorical questions and so on. But, tell us what is to come hereafter, that we may know your gods. Do good or do harm. Do something. You can't do anything. I stirred up one from the north. That's Cyrus again. The Persian Empire was based in the east, but the sort of conquest route into Israel always came down from the north. So you will find both geographical references. And he has come. From the rising of the sun, he shall call on my name. He shall trample on rulers as on mortar, as the potter treads clay. Who declared it from the beginning, that we might know, and before time that we might say, he is right? There was none who declared it, none who proclaimed, none who heard your words. I first have declared it to Zion, and I give to Jerusalem a herald of good tidings. See, God is taking on the spiritual forces that, claim sovereignty and claim to be in control of world events. And he's saying, no, not true. I am the sovereign God. Who else? Interestingly, going back to our little discussion a couple of weeks ago about whether there's 1, 2 or 3 Isaiahs. The more I read this, the more I think there's one Isaiah. Because one of the arguments God is using in the courtroom to prove that he is the true God and not a fake God is that he foretells events. Who declared it from the beginning that we might know, and before time that we might say he is right? There was none who declared it, none who proclaimed, none who heard words. I first have declared it to Zion. I give to Jerusalem a herald of good tidings. God is the sovereign God. He knows in advance what is going to happen. He gives his people forewarning of it in this case, and he is sovereign Lord. Now this is so hard to keep in our own minds. The big tides of history are in God's hands and under his sovereign authority. Now, that begs all sorts of difficult questions which we haven't got time really to explore, because it means that God is Lord of evil rulers. And you have to unravel that. Even for Cyrus, as we will see, it was blessing for God's people, but it was bad news for an awful lot of other people. But the word of the Lord is, I am sovereign Lord over history. The world has all sorts of, sort of solutions, flounders around, but the world is not capable of directing its own affairs, controlling its own future, stopping these forces that are happening. So they were living in troubled times. We maybe are living in troubled times. If you feel your life's okay, many, many people in many parts of the world will tell you they are living in dark times when they feel that they are victims of forces just too big for them to have an answer to. And it's in that context that we put the middle verses in. And they start with one of those great buts in Scripture. And but you, Israel, my servant. You see, and that word but, there's a lot sort of invested in that word. The word but means it's going to be different for you. What we've looked at so far is describing what it's like for the nations who don't know God and who run around after futile solutions and idols. But you, Israel, my servant, it's going to be different for you in the same set of circumstances. I've put a few words in bold here. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the offspring of Abraham, my friend, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from its farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant, I have chosen you and not cast you off. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. For I, the Lord your God, hold your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not, I will help you. So I've just sort of underlined a few words. We, as the people of God, Israel and Jacob, we are chosen by God. We are the offspring of God's friends. We are called. We are not cast off. Fear not. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you. I will hold your hand. Isn't that amazing? I will hold your hand. And I say, fear not, I will help you. When faced with circumstances and situations that are just threatening to swamp us, whether they be personal or, massive geopolitical, God's word is, but my people, you don't need to be afraid. Because you are my people. I've chosen you. I've called you. For Israel, Abraham was called my friend. Obviously, we have Jesus as our friend. Jesus as our advocate. God says, I'm on your side. I will help you. I will strengthen you. I will hold your hand. Isn't that a lovely picture? So, we are called God's servant, but interestingly, there is absolutely no sense of you're my servant, you are going to have to do lots and lots of stuff to serve me. This is just you are my servant, and so I have an obligation to you. I have chosen you as my servant, and therefore I am committed to protecting you, looking after you, and being your helper. Fear not. The fearful protected. The weak made strong. Just reading on. Fear not, you worm, Jacob. Do you feel like a worm sometimes? Do you sometimes look at the church and think, it's a bit pathetic, isn't it? Fear not, you worm, Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, says the Lord. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Behold, I will make of you a threshing sledge, new, sharp, and having teeth. You shall thresh the mountains and crush them. You shall make the hills like chaff. You shall winnow them, and the wind will carry them away, and the tempest shall scatter them. And you shall rejoice in the Lord, in the Holy One of Israel. You shall glory. If you read enough of Isaiah, you will know that he regularly uses sort of pictures from the natural world to illustrate, as metaphors or whatever of what he is saying. So, you picture a little worm turning into a threshing sledge, this massive sort of heavy wooden thing with sharp teeth that threshes the corn. And you little worm are going to crush mountains. It's a picture, it's not literal, it's a picture. And you shall rejoice in the Lord. So even when things are tough and the world has no reason to rejoice, you've got reason to rejoice. You can feel safe when you're fearful, and you can rejoice and feel strong when we in our own strength may seem very weak. And it goes on. When the poor and needy seek water, and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst, I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open rivers on the bare heights, and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land springs of water. I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane, and the pine together, that men may see and know, may consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this, the Holy One of Israel has created it. Fruitfulness in dry, parched desert times. Again, if we're honest, there's times in all our lives when we feel pretty dry and parched and lifeless, and life is just one hard slog. And God says, I'm going to, again, picture language, I'm going to pour water on your desert lands. I'm going to cause fountains to rise up in the valleys. By the way, fountains are normally on high ground and they run down. Fountains to rise up. I'm going to cause all sorts of lovely trees and fruit trees and so on to grow in the desert. And people are going to look on and see that God's doing it. So, that really is Isaiah 41. It's this amazing sort of contrast. And as we go through more Isaiah chapters, you will find that a lot of these themes get repeated in slightly different ways and reinforced. It's a bit like, I'm no musician, but I know in sort of symphonies, you have your sort of core melodies and you keep coming back to them with different variations and different instrumentation and and then it goes off and does different things and comes back to the core message. And Isaiah is a bit like that. You're going to keep hearing these same melodies, if you like, that God is sovereign over the nations. It's not random what's going on. God knows about all these dangerous, threatening, worrying things. He is actually in control. He foresaw them. The nations are going to flounder. The nations are going to respond with one idol after another, which is futility at best and demonic at worst. But in the midst of that, but you, my servant Israel, but you, my people, you're different. You can respond differently. Whether it's a personal challenge in your own local circumstances or whether it is the wider global situation or context that you're in, you don't need to be fearful, flounder around, feel victims of forces you can't control. You don't need to be negative. Fear not, that's looking at been in red, fear not, I will help you. You shall rejoice in the Lord, in the Holy One of Israel, you shall glory. That men may see and know, may consider and understand together that the hand of the Lord has done this, the Holy One of Israel has created it. That's the security of the people of God. So, we're in a troubled, fearful world. We have a sovereign God, but we also have a loving God and a peaceful people. And coming back to the verse of Jesus, I've said these things to you that you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but be not afraid, I have overcome the world. So we can live protected in dangerous times. That, I believe, is the message of Isaiah 41. And I think that's the message of God to us as a people.